Someone asked me this week if I really believed in the resurrection. And I said, yes, I do. And I don't know if this is what the person was expecting me to say or not. And I don't know if this person believed me or not. And if you know me very well at all, you'll know that I am big on both metaphor and mystery. And I think there is mystery aplenty in the faith statements about resurrection. And yet, this is not one of those moments where I want to wordsmith my way into saying yes. For me, it's deeper than just the cycle of life. I love caterpillars becoming butterflies. That's great, but for me, that's not quite Easter. So I want to share with you one of the stories that has shaped my understanding and appreciation of Easter. I want to tell you about the Reverend Tim Favell. Tim was my supervisor for a summer when I did what was called CPE. That stands for Clinical Pastoral Education. I worked in a cohort with 5 seminary students, all from my seminary, and we learned, and we were set out onto the floors of Columbia Presbyterian's Children's Hospital in New York City. And Tim was our supervisor for this 10-week super intensive process. Now, Tim was a legend, not just at the hospital, but also at our seminary campus. He was a large presence, and he could light up any room. He started off as a budding star on Broadway. He started to take on big roles in the late 70s and early 80s. And then the AIDS epidemic hit, and that upended his life, including his career. He found himself holding hands and visiting his gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. He found himself holding a lot of babies. And that led him to go to seminary uptown and to pursue chaplaincy. Tim was ordained in the United Church of Christ, and he served as the first and the only official chaplain to the entire Children's Hospital. He also served as a supervisor to chaplain interns there, both in the summer and throughout the year. And I think it's fair to say that he taught a whole generation of chaplains or seminary students while he was in that call. And early on, I heard that if you have to do CPE, and I did, he's the one you want. Don't go to those other places. Don't get anyone else. You need Tim. And so I began that chaplaincy that summer. And as I remember, it was a summer of high highs and low lows. The journey through CPE is intensely reflective. I was assigned the emergency room, half of the neonatal intensive care, the NICU, and a floor of step-down patients with head and heart surgeries. I had many experiences, or many opportunities, to experience life and death and big emotions, in both myself and in patients. Tim walked with me through traumatic events in hospital rooms and tearful reflections after. I still think back to some of those conversations. I still wonder. I am still learning from his teaching. And as the summer wound down, Tim invited me to consider coming back to the Children's Hospital and becoming a chaplain and a CPE supervisor like him. He was desperate to have a female colleague who could take on the labor and delivery and be a presence on those floors, and even shows how wonderful his politics were, because he didn't want to intrude, and he wanted women, to have another woman on the floor with them. He just had this great sense of boundaries. And I genuinely felt honored and seen and invited by his invitation. Our last conversation was this whirlwind of me chasing him around the chaplain's office as he was great with people, not so much with paper. And he was trying to locate some printouts in my certificate and documentation that I needed to show to my ordination committee. And as we walked and talked, he confided in me that he had a serious heart condition. And he reminded me of a story he told us earlier in the summer about his parents also dying from a heart condition. I remember thinking that this was such an odd time to tell me this. I've reflected many times with wonder, was this another one of Tim's learning moments? Was he trying to see what I would do? Because that's how he taught. Was he watching for how I would respond? Or was this a moment of him actually trying to connect with me on a deeper level, letting his guard down to a potential new colleague and new friend? I will never know his intentions, but I remember that conversation. The fall began, classes resumed, and Tim began teaching some of my friends. They were starting the year-long CPE process. And they would meet weekly on campus on Wednesday evenings. And I had a weekly dinner with friends at the same time, and we would take turns who was cooking. And I remember it was my turn to cook, and it caused me great anxiety because my friends were really good, and I was not. I was the weak cooking link in that group. And I was fretting about what to do after seminary, and I heard the people talking about, well, we're going to be chaplains one day, and I remember thinking, I might need to get in there and see if my place is still secured. And I just remember being pulled, really pulled to go see Tim all week. And then as we got closer and I started baking cookies, I thought, aha, I'll bake extra cookies and I'll be the cool friend who brings in all these cookies to your CPE class. And I'll just be like, hey, Tim. There was something drawing me to go say hello to Tim that night, and I can still tell you what it felt like. But in the end, I didn't go. I went to my dinner. We had, as I recall, a fine time. And I started to walk back up to my apartment. And it's kind of all a blur from there. Because one of my dear friends, Julie, who had just been in that class, that CPE class, had evidently offered Tim a ride back uptown to the hospital. And he was going to do another round of visiting people before he went home for the night. And as they were a few blocks away from the hospital, Tim had a massive heart attack and died in the back of her car. And she called me. And she believed him to be dead, but they were still working on his body. Could I round up the classmates and get them all to the hospital? So I ran, and I knocked on doors, and I texted, and I called. And then I stopped by my room just to pick up a jacket and my keys and a wallet, and my fear caught up with me. And I couldn't move. And I was spinning. And then my phone started to light up. Hey, where are you? We need to go. Where are you? Answer your phone. So I ran back down the stairs. They had already flagged 2 cabs because there were so many of us that were in this together, and we prayed and we anticipated the worst. And my friends were all working at the hospital, so they all had their little ID badges, their security clearances that I had to give back. And so they put me in the middle of this huddle, and we just very confidently walked into the emergency room, and I made no eye contact. I just walked in. And I hadn't been in that emergency room before because we were in the adult side of the hospital. It's not as bright and beautiful as the children's hospital. And it was night, and everything was kind of dark and eerie. And Julie saw us, and she came up to us, and she embraced us. And I remember being in this huddle of people. And then I looked behind me into the room where they were still working on Tim. And all I saw were his socked feet. And that's all I needed to see or know. Somehow, seeing the socks was enough. And we were escorted to a private waiting room, and Tim's husband came soon after. And eventually, we were given the sad news that he was dead. And we, as chaplains or chaplain startups, started calling people that we knew. And I called my favorite person from that summer, and we talked, and I asked her to call a couple of other people. And before I could call the person who was next on my list, my phone lit up. And lo and behold, it was my least favorite person from the summer, the one who always seemed a little bit too needy. And she was calling me to tell me that Tim had died. Only she didn't have any of the right facts. And a game of telephone had already begun between nurses, and one of those nurses called someone who was a children's hospital nurse, and that children's hospital nurse had called her. And so I let her know in pretty no uncertain terms that she was telling idle tales. That was one of my last conversations with that woman. It was a long and terrible night that lasted for days, informing professors, not thinking about it, but informing professors that their friend, colleague had died, being the first people with the news. It wasn't fun. I remember thinking to myself, this is how it happens. There were so many similarities. Humans swirling after a sudden death of a much beloved friend and teacher and colleague, a community who had this bright light just out. And I was to learn, as people remembered, that I was not the only person who had been drawn to Tim in his final couple of weeks. His husband shared that Tim had been in contact with people via phone and text and email that he hadn't spoken to in years. Something in his spirit was pulling his community together, and I was blessed to be caught up in it. And I wonder, as I look at our story, I wonder if Jesus was doing the same thing. I wonder if the crowds on Palm Sunday were drawn there because sometimes that's what happens. I wonder if people like me heard the terrible news and couldn't bring themselves to leave their rooms in fear and in grief. I wonder if others couldn't help but run and jump in a cab and go see for themselves. I wonder if, like Peter, you look into a tomb expecting one thing and all you see is a scrap of cloth, and something changes within you. And you remember the warning about death. You remember the sense of needing to be near. You remember the fear and the jumble of what's going on and what happens next, and the stories start circulating. And only later do we remember and put the pieces together enough to know that something extraordinary happened. And the women will tell their truths and the men will dismiss them. But Peter hopes. Friends, Easter leaves me with a lot of questions. Did Jesus rise on Sunday morning?
Yes.
Amen, brother. I wouldn't put it past him. Did Jesus rise? I don't know because I wasn't there, but neither the literal nor the metaphor do justice when we talk about an experience like this. That experience of Tim still marks me today. It still haunts me and it still claims me. Because I want to be more like Tim, and Tim wanted us to be more like Christ. Do I believe in resurrection? You bet. I've experienced it. It's a story to be lived. And I hope that we all have a story of such great love that carries us through when we feel grief and we wonder about what's next, and when we are facing our fears. I hope we all have a story of God's love that carries us through. So may we all remember and trust in God's powerful presence. May we be that community of scattered and broken people connected by something that is mysterious and wonderful and true. So may it be. Amen.